So we've reached 1:30, and I think we'll therefore make a start. It's a delight to be here this evening and to know that you're all joining us, even if we can't see you. So welcome to the second in our series of webinars on power in the Church of England. This is a new venture. I'm one part of a small steering group that is running this, and we're looking forward to this series running for quite some time. There's a lot of webinars that we've got already lined up, and possibilities for further webinars in the future. The idea is to explore quite broadly questions about power in the Church of England, many forms that power takes in the life of the Church, the ways in which those forms of power shape people's experience in and around the Church, the various accounts of power that circulate around the Church, what it means for power to be exercised in healthy ways, and also the nature and impact of the misuse and abuse of power. So a broad agenda. The first webinar we had was on questions about power over and power with, and the video for that is up online, and I'll post the link to that again a bit later. But for this second webinar, we're tackling the question of disability and power in the Church of England. And we'll be hearing from Katie Tupling and Naomi Lewis in just a moment. But first, a couple of practicalities. Can I ask those of you who aren't presenting to keep your microphones muted, and can I ask you also to turn your video off? Even though you're not visible on the screen, it can affect bandwidth for people who are watching on some devices if other videos are enabled. So please keep your videos off and your microphones muted. After some presentations from Katie and Naomi, we will have time for Q&A, and we'll ask you at that point to put your questions in the chat function. But can I ask you to do that only after the initial presentations have finished, because it can otherwise be really distracting both for presenters and for other people in the room if the chat keeps pinging up all the way through. Just to let you know that we are recording this session, and the video will go up later on, so you'll have a chance to rewatch if you've missed anything. And I'll say a little bit more right at the end about the final video. But that's enough from me. So at this point, I will hand over to Katie to take us into the session proper.
Fabulous. Thank you, Mike. I do feel like I'm sort of treading very carefully in the shoes of great people, because the first session we had just last month was absolutely cracking. It was really good, and a great introduction to the big themes around power. So coming second, I'm glad to be second, not first. But I'm also treading carefully, because I see in amongst the guest list a lot of people who I suspect could have done this better than me. But I'm the one you've got, and that's another reason why I invited Naomi to join me and be my partner in crime in today's session. Naomi will introduce themselves in a moment, but first me. So for those who I've not come across before, my name's Katie Tupling. I write it as KT because I'm lazy and can't be bothered to fingerspell or write Katie. Very lazy indeed. But I also kind of identify in that way of being sort of more than male, female. It's kind of about identity, and KT is me, and there are millions of KATIEs across the world. So it's something there about personal identity. I'll explore that another time because I haven't thought it through myself yet, but that's where I'm at. I am disabled, so if you're hoping that lived experience is an integral part of this session, you're in luck today. I was born with cerebral palsy, and I am disabled both by the medical condition I come with and also the way that society puts things in the way, and when they're pointed out, doesn't always want to move the obstacles. So disabled by both medical condition diagnosed when I was young, and society at large, and structures, shall we say, including the C of E. My working life was in telesales. I will never do that again, but it paid the bills, if you follow my drift. And then I was a youth and children's worker across Birmingham. And then finally, God won the arm wrestle, and I ended up being ordained. I was ordained in 2003. and have been in parish-based ministry from then till roughly now. In 2019, I came to the Oxford Diocese to work for the dark side. I'll stop saying that. To work for the diocese as a disability advisor part-time. And that's what I do at the moment. I get paid to do that. In my non-paid time, I'm a wife and a mother, a narrowboat lover, and real ale drinker. So if you ever want to thank me for something, don't send money, that's complicated tax-wise, but a crate of real ale would go down exceptionally well. I'm also co-founder of Disability and Jesus. We are online because online is free and we haven't got any money. And we are a task force, primarily 2 of us, but a wider community, because we want to see things happen rather than just talk theology. And we have as our underlying basis the fact that, yes, you can be disabled and a disciple at the same time. One does not need fixing before the other can be fully fruition. So I don't need my CP to be miraculously cured and then become a better disciple. I am a pretty good disciple to and through my disability and my cerebral palsy. So that's me in a nutshell. There's an Austin Powers joke there about nutshells, but I shan't do it now. I'm going to hand over to Naomi and they can introduce themselves. And then I'll give you a bit more on my own thoughts on power, disability, and the Church of England.
Hello, so I'm Naomi Lewis and Jacobs. My pronouns are they, them. I am a disabled and neurodivergent activist researcher. My PhD in sociology of religion was inspired by my own journey in and out of churches and sort of back again through chronic illness, autism and ADHD. And after completing an MA in disability studies, I began to realize how little social research there is out there about disabled people's lived experiences of churches and faith. And that realization led me to do participatory qualitative research with now up to 50 disabled and neurodivergent Christians. I was based at SOAS University of London, and I have a book forthcoming co-written with Emily Richardson, which will share these disabled people's experiences with a church that hasn't always centered our stories. I'm active in a growing disabled Christian movement that's coming together in new ways on the edge of institutional churches, often meeting online in some of the ways that Katie's mentioned. And for many years, I was part of the planning team of the first disabled-led Christian conference in the UK, a partnership between St Martin in the Fields Church and Inclusive Church. I'm a contract researcher in the not-for-profit sector. I train Christian organisations in disability equality, and I'm married to Shay, and my cats are my favourite people. And that's all about me.
Naomi and I share many things in common. One of them is we both talk too quickly, and I'm watching Rachel, who's currently interpreting for us in BSL, with her hands steaming at the speed they're having to move at. So Rachel, and later on other Naomi, thank you in advance for the BSL interpreting you're doing. Friends who need live transcription and closed captioning, that has been enabled, and you should, a year and a half into a pandemic, know where to find that on your device to be able to turn the transcript on at the bottom of the screen. So I'm now going to do the awkward Zoom thing of staring at random bits of my own screen to try and find my PowerPoint, which hopefully you can see on your screen. I think I have 2 versions of it, which is rather unfortunate. It's still behind itself already. I'm looking for a thumbs up from either Rachel, an interpreter, or Naomi, the speaker, that everything looks okay on screen. Grand, thank you. So these are a few thoughts, an introduction, a taster, if you like, into the idea of power, into what disability means, and the Church of England, as far as I've experienced it and understood it from others and their stories, and how they all come together. And I only use PowerPoint because I think visually, and so therefore I share it with you if it's helpful, but this isn't death by PowerPoint. You don't have to rely on it at all. So Martin Luther King Jr. said this about power. Power properly understood is nothing but the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. But power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. So if we're thinking about power, it has a purpose. It wants to go somewhere. It wants to see something that changes as a result of its intervention. But it also has the checks and balances. And in Martin Luther King's situation, love is the check and the balance to ensure that power has boundaries and has a deep purpose. And power, of course, without love is what we see in cases of genocide and war, and individuals going off the rails with other human beings. I'm not going to mention Home Secretaries, definitely not. But that's the kind of power relationship Martin Luther King was observing. When power insists but doesn't have love as a boundary, then power is very dangerous. And in our last session, our first of these webinars, Frances Ward was one of the speakers then, and she said this: power is not a possession, but agency. And I was very struck by that word agency, the fact that somebody has the power in their hands and perhaps over somebody else. And Liz talked to us last time about power over, power to, power with, and power within. Those different ways that power is exercised or yielded or used over other people. So the idea that power is agency always makes me ask the question, who has the agency in the room in any given situation? And when it comes to power, that's a very powerful question to ask in itself. I wonder what the disability outside the church world thinks about power. What do they perceive? And the Disability Power 100, which I think is a great phrase, they want to celebrate diversity, and the Power List is there to do that. It's an annual publication that highlights and champions the work of from their point of view, the top 100 disabled influencers in the country as nominated by the public. So for the Disability Power 100, power is about influence. And again, it asks the question of who has the agency in that relationship of influence. For the Disability Power 100, it is people who are influencing in a good way to further the cause and help people understand what it is to be a disabled person in this country and where the barriers are. So power and influence in that sense. And Disability Rights UK believe that all disabled people should be able to gain control over their own lives. There's something about control here. Take initiative, share wisdom and talents, and participate fully in society. And when a power structure says no to all of that, and the disabled group can't say yes, a question of agency comes about again. It's about an equalisation of power for Disability Rights UK, where all come together around a table, if they can get in the room or the building in the first place, of course. And there is an equality of voice, equality of opinion, and equality of narrative, and ultimately an equality of who makes changes and how it's done for the better. And again, for Disability Rights UK, disabled people should be in the lead in everything that Disability UK does, sharing knowledge, sharing advice, and sharing experience. Now, actually, if every single structure followed that pattern, when it comes to disability, let's have disabled people take the lead on this, tell us what needs to happen, us being the able-bodied structure, that would be transformative. However, what we actually have is that disabled people, generally speaking, are seen as one of four things. The first is objects of pity. Shane Clifton writes this: charity and pity are oppressive because they play on fear, sustain the superiority of the benevolent, and make people with disability acutely aware of their lesser status. Generally, charity involves the rich and powerful acting upon the relatively powerless person with disability. We see this in the secular society in terms of things like children in need, where the disabled children are tragic stories, but we, the rich, able-bodied, can make their life much happier. But we have to hear the tragedy story in order to engender pity in ourselves and a fear of, gosh, that could be my child, and therefore I will give money. I grew up with that narrative of the children in need tragedy as a child myself. It's only now looking back I realize that, and I resent it immensely. Of course, the church doesn't do that. I'll let you put that in chat later if you think it does. Disabled people, not just objects of pity, but we are to be discussed, not consulted. Again, of course, not the church, but let's just take the government for a second. Theresa Coffey, the government's Works and Pensions Secretary, told a High Court she did not have a legal duty to consult with disabled people on the cross-government strategy on disability, and therefore she chose not to. We are to be discussed and not to be involved. How often have I visited buildings and asked about accessibility and being told we have a ramp? Does it comply with Part M of the building regulations? What's that? Well, let me tell you about ratios, and I'm not going down that in my wheels, thank you very much, unless I have full skateboarding kit on and a helmet. Why should you talk to disabled people about their needs when clearly you know better? Doesn't happen in the church, of course. We'll get onto that in a minute. Disabled people as objects who are deviant from the accepted norm. You see, every structure, including the Church of England, has an accepted norm of what people should look like and behave like. So, as we are talking about the Church of England priest should really, in an ideal world, be male, white, middle class, Oxbridge educated ideally, because then you know he has a thinking brain. He really ought to have a wife. I mean, just the one. We don't really want anyone bereaved because of the baggage, or divorced, because that's really not a good idea. And their kids should be impeccably behaved. Ideally, a couple of boys first, because that proves that the man has got good seed, and then some lovely girls. And together they can run the music group. They can be a paragon to all the other children in the church, because they've clearly got lots of kids in the church. And that is the norm that the C of E has unwittingly put out there. And anyone who's not that knows that they're not that. The same for disabled people. We know full well that the accepted norm of society is fit and healthy, paying your tax, paying your national insurance, having a worthwhile job, and being useful. And many of us don't entirely fit that mold. And boy, do we know it. Privilege comes into play there. Able-bodied norms are very privileged. And finally, we are objects who challenge the given ideology. We turn to a system, those of us who put our heads above the parapet and say, I have questions, can I just... We challenge the given norms. We say, hang on a second, you talk about these things as though they're important, but where is the evidence? There was a report done, the Asia Pacific Bureau for Adult Education, done in 1993, and although it's an old report, it's still very relevant. And it says the economic, political, legal, and judicial institutions and structures set up and mediated by the state tend to reinforce the dominant ideology and the power of the dominant groups within it, even though their stated objectives and policies may be superficially egalitarian. So for the Church of England, we talk an awful lot. I say we, I mean the people with pointy hats further up the food chain than me, talk an awful lot about the value of disabled people within ordained ministry, lay authorized ministry, and in the pews. But I don't see it for myself. And look at me with a dog collar. You think being on the inside, I'd see the reality of what it is the ideology talked about, but I don't. When I talk about disability, I want to offer you 5 models of thinking about what I mean by that, because the word disabled does get bandied around a huge amount. And even within the disabled community, now there's a misnomer, I'm not sure we're that well organized to be called a community, but we have a lot in common with our shared narrative. So we'll go with it for the minute. Even within the disabled community, we all kind of disagree a little bit about what disabled means. And I think it depends on age and stage and whether you were born with or acquired disability at the start of life or through life. But generally speaking, there are 5 models of disability, of which they have offshoots, but not for tonight. The first one, the most long-reaching one, the one that you see through history and archaeology and sociology, is what we now call the medical model. The individual person has a diagnosis, or maybe pre-diagnosis, and it's really down to them to change. There's something wrong with them medically, and they need intervention to get them to a normal life where possible. So healthcare in a compassionate society is about improving the person for their own sake, because who wants to be not normal? Looking at my friend Naomi and going, well, I'm quite happy being not normal. But anyway, all the normal people have been running the universe since eternity. Let's have our turn to have a go at it. They're not doing a good job of it. So anyway, so medically, I'm the one that needs to make the changes in my own body through intervention, surgical, physiotherapy, and of course with the Church of England and any kind of faith religion, prayer. With the right prayer, the right physio, the right medication, the right surgery, one day I'll be normal. Spoiler alert, not true. The social model came in, I guess, kind of in the 60s and 70s. They're nothing about us without us, cry from the heart from those who are seeking social justice. And the social model is completely opposed to the medical model. To the point I think it goes too far. Something in between is a good thing. Social model says, no, there is nothing wrong with Katie Tupling. We'll come on to that later. But actually structures need to change. You need a wheelchair? Great. Let's make sure the lift works and the ramps are there, the right gradients. You have hearing loss. Let's make sure the T-loops are all turned on and actually working. You have sight loss. Let's make sure there's nothing in the way you're going to fall over. And we put tactile paving on the edge of railway platforms so you don't fall onto the rails. You'd be amazed how many platforms do not have tactile edges. The social model says there's nothing wrong with the individual. They've got a medical condition, that's it. Society is disabling. The individual model says, oh, it sucks to be you, doesn't it? Look at, oh dear, I'm glad I'm not you. What a tragedy to be you and disabled like you are. I mean, what if something happened in a previous life that made you like this? I wonder whose fault it is. But it's down to the individual, and there's no communal ownership of this. The charity model we've touched on, I'm glad I'm not you. Oh gosh, but I'll just throw some money at you because you're a victim of circumstance. And we, the rich and the privileged, will put some money into the pot and then we'll feel a lot better. And finally, the eugenics model. Your value, Katie, I'm afraid is limited, and you cost us money in terms of healthcare and social care and welfare. And you're not contributing a great deal, are you? So better if you weren't here. The health minister for Iceland 2 years ago came on screen and said, I'm very pleased to announce we have eradicated all live births of Down syndrome in our country. Yay! Bunting, flags, confetti. I have questions. He didn't say they prevented Down syndrome in the womb. He said there were no live births of Down syndrome. Where are all those babies? The tragedy narrative that Down syndrome babies cost us, the society, money, and therefore better if they weren't here. Just a couple more thoughts from me before I hand over to Naomi. My training incumbent, the person who was overseeing me when I first got ordained, and I was a curate, an apprentice, vicar, was absolutely amazing. He said to me, and he put in our working agreement, and he said to the congregation when I first met them, Katie has been called by God to be ordained, to be our curate, to be my colleague, and to flourish. And where disability raises challenges, we'll face them together with determination and humour. He was the polar opposite of the process I had gone through to get to ordination in the first place. Every advisor I was sent to go and see over the course of 5 years had the same questions. How will you manage? Are you really sure that a disabled person is being called to ordained ministry? You won't be able to never mind, will you? You won't be able to handle the elements at Mass. For non-church jargon people, it's the cup and the saucer, in essence, that holds the wine and the wafers or the real bread that you hold up at the altar and say the institutional words over. You won't be able to do that. Well, I think you'll find I can move a kettle, love, so I can do that. You won't be able to carry out pastoral visits. Well, I can get into a house. People spend more time worrying about you and concerned you're going to fall over than concentrating on the Lord. To be honest, you're all distracted by the knitting and the gossip, so I'm not sure that I'm any more of a distraction than that, if I'm being fair. You'll be a distraction during worship. So are the people talking on the back row. How can you offer healing prayers with any integrity? We talk about healing and cure and the difference between the two till the cows come home. But all of those things were said to me on more than one occasion by more than one person in my vocations journey and in the 18 years I've been ordained. Finally, here's an interesting fact for all those of you who like thinking about canon law. Canon C4 of the quality of such as to be ordained deacons or priests, part 3. No person to be admitted into holy orders who is suffering or who has suffered from any physical or mental infirmity, which in the opinion of the bishop will prevent them from ministering the word and sacraments or from performing the other duties of the minister's office. This is in canon law. Actually, it falls foul of the Equality Act, but it's still embedded in our very thinking and practice of the Church of England. No other protected characteristics has this possibility of outright veto by a bishop based on opinion and not medical fact. We can be prevented from any kind of authorized ministry on the opinion of the bishop. If you're disabled in the Church of England, who has the agency over your place in it at this point? I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to let Naomi take over and do her bit of this.
Okay, so let me just share my screen. Can you see that, Katie? Brilliant. So I'm going to describe everything that's on the slides. It's not very much, it's just a few pointers to what I'm saying, but for accessibility reasons, I'll say what's on there. So the background of my slide here is an image of a demonstration from the 1990s, quite a famous one, when disabled people chained themselves to buses and their wheelchairs and walkers to protest inaccessible public transport. And picking up on some of what Katie said, I just want to briefly start with the question, who are disabled people? Because I'm quite often asked, aren't we all a bit disabled? My answer is no, but I want to explain briefly why not. Disability is created by a system of normalcy. Ever since the rise of capitalism, society has needed its workers to be productive. And those who don't fit the physical and mental demands of modern society have been marginalized ever since. Disabled people experience significantly higher rates of poverty than non-disabled people. We have to fight for our rights to live independently. Our community has a history of forced sterilization and eugenics of the kind that Katie was talking about, including a recent history. This is not just centuries ago. We're excluded from buildings, education, communication, our local communities and churches. And we call this systemic ableism. Disabled people are a very diverse group. And as Katie was saying, we can use lots of models to explain who's disabled. But on a very basic level, if your body or your mind diverges far enough from what society considers normal, you are othered and you are disabled. And in the first webinar in this series, we heard a bit about power over and power with. And I'm going to talk more today about power to. And power too is agency. It's the ability to act, the potential of every person to shape their life and their world, in the words of Lawson and Miller. And when people's lives are controlled by those with power over us, it can be difficult for us to have that power too. And in the corner here, I hope you can see it behind the pictures, is an image of one of the first disability rights marches in the UK, members of the National League of the Blind in 1920. And at the front of their march is a banner that reads, "Justice, not charity." Disabled people have been calling for rights, not charity, or justice, not charity, for a century. And we've only had civil rights since 1995 in any meaningful way. And that took decades of campaigning, after which we eventually got a Disability Discrimination Act, now rolled into the Equality Act. The civil rights it gives us are quite weak, but it does exist, and it wouldn't have happened without disabled people's fight for power to act in society. Power over disabled people can be hard to spot because it often has benevolent aims. And Katie was telling us about the charity model, and that's where this comes into play. There's a powerful disability business at work in society today, and there has been for many years. Charities and professionals set the agenda for our lives. As Katie told us before, we describe this approach as the charity model of disability. And it's a very subtle form of power over because it looks like goodwill and care. We only care about you. We want to make your lives better. But often you want to make our lives better based on your assumptions of what the good life is. And it's created a society in which disabled people are disempowered and don't have a great deal of agency over our own lives. And that's why, as Katie said, one of the slogans of the disabled people's movement has been "Nothing about us without us." So I want to relate this to the church a little bit. If I can go back here. Because how the church and society see disability are linked much more closely than we might otherwise think, because they've fed into each other for centuries. The church was the first provider of care for disabled people. And I'm having trouble with my slide here, 1 second. There we go. I've got a picture here by Crippen, the satirical disabled cartoonist, of two disabled people and one person pointing at a sign that says "Normality Training, how to stop upsetting people by looking disabled." And one of the disabled people says, "Be normal, but what makes you think we'd want to lower our standards?" But the church has often thought of us as tragedies in need of charity. And again, another little cartoon, a man in a suit standing in front of a sign that says "Federation of Charities for the Disabled," saying to a wheelchair user, "When we want your opinion, we'll tell you what it is." Throughout church history, the church has remembered Jesus's regard for the poor and the marginalized, and churches have shared the gospel through hospitality, caring for those in need. And that's a good thing. It especially was when no one else was caring for disabled people. But there's a dark side to this history. When the powerful reach out to those in the margins, it's easy for them to believe that they have everything to offer, and us, the recipients of the charity, only have need. In churches today, there's still a focus on pastoral care for disabled people, and that can distract from our need for access, inclusion, and justice. So for my research participants, this focus on pastoral care could be disempowering. It left lay people feeling that they were in church to be served by others, not to serve. People saw them coming as targets of their charity, which is not very empowering when what you want to be is an equal member of a faith community. The disabled ministers I spoke to had a uniquely difficult time. They faced constant barriers to ordination and ministers because they were expected to be ministered to, not to minister to others, as Katie has told us in her journey. There are occupational barriers to priesthood in the Church of England because the church's ideal of a priest is non-disabled. Priests are expected to be the embodiment of the power of God, although we might have a mistaken image of the power of God in mind there. So people are asked, how will you offer communion, as Katie was. One very straightforward minister in my research pointed out that she could do it from the front of the altar because God is just as present at floor level as everywhere else. But it can be quite a challenge to argue these liturgical issues, where in fact disability is not affecting the liturgy, but for non-disabled people, they are reading disability as a problem to liturgy. And beyond buildings, our church cultures assume that priests will be non-disabled too. So the church church asks chronically ill priests to work long hours, and it doubts people's ability to lead if they show signs of weakness. Again, not necessarily the model of leadership that Jesus gave us. And we've heard from Katie about the canon laws that are an occupational barrier to disabled people's ministry. We could argue that the Church of England is institutionally ableist, and this is not a surprise because many institutions are, especially as they get big enough. But the Church's ableism is specific, it's rooted in its institutional history of care and not necessarily being able to let go of that history until it becomes power over disabled people. Church buildings and church cultures stay inaccessible to us because all the decisions made about how church happens are made by non-disabled people. And the other way that churches see us, in the same way as society does, is abnormal. I spoke a moment ago about normalcy, which places very narrow limits on what it means to be human, and the church shares that concept. Our buildings are designed around the needs of the non-disabled majority who fit the norm and who have power and privilege. And society is full of these spaces of power, as geographers call them. So when disabled people's different bodies and minds meet churches that were not designed for us, we become the square pegs trying to fit round holes. So mobility impaired people may not be able to participate in communion as the same way as others, depending on how communion is envisaged. Those with chronic pain may suffer, not because of their bodies necessarily, but because when their bodies meet hard pews, they're not comfortable. And the noise of a new heating system drove one of my autistic participants away from church altogether. Just a heating system. Imagine if that choice of heating system had been different and she could have stayed. And it's not just buildings that make churches into spaces of power, it's how we use those buildings and what that says about who we value in terms of who's using them. Every Sunday, church leaders and warders and ministers make decisions about access. They decide whether to create subtitles for the videos they're showing, and whether to give trigger warnings about sermon content, and whether to hold the Bible study in a poorly lit room. These decisions show disabled people whether we are just invited to church or truly included in the community, as disability theologian Lamar Hardwick puts it. There is an often repeated myth that the Equality Act doesn't cover churches and church buildings. It's not true, but it's very interesting how often that myth is repeated and what it might say about our beliefs. Disabled people in my research were very used to hearing from church leaders that it was too expensive to make access provision for 1 or 2 people. And yet God says 1 sheep in 99 matters. This is all part of why disabled people in society today tend to see the church as the enemy of true social inclusion, rather than seeing Christianity as part of the answer, which is an absolute tragedy. And wouldn't it be a countercultural witness if Church of England leaders said, as a church, we want to do better than the secular law, and we will use our resources and finances to make sure that everyone can hear the gospel? It would have a profound effect on more people than you'd imagine. I've got just one example. One of my research participants, Brianna, attended a very inaccessible church for many years, and one day she visited another church. And in her words, she said, "Oh my word, the welcome." She wasn't talking about friendly people at the door. She was talking about wheelchair spaces among the congregation so that she could sit in the body of Christ, and the sight of other disabled people worshipping around her. She found an embodied welcome in a church that shared its power with disabled Christians and listened to its disabled congregants and made sure none of them felt like they didn't fit. I'd love to say a bit about healing as cure, as Katie hinted at, but I don't have time. So I'm going to move on to a bit of a conclusion and ask who speaks for us as disabled Christians. Because amid all this ableism and injustice, the question of who speaks for us determines the question of whether we have the power to speak for ourselves and contribute to change or not. And I've just lost my place, I'll be right with you. And that's why we have always said nothing about us without us. So theology of disability today is dominated by non-disabled theologians who speak about us rather than with us. That doesn't mean that their voices and stories aren't important, but they're not our stories. And again, this is no great surprise because there's a powerful disability business in society, and it started with the church. And there are barriers to disabled people engaging in theology. There are academic barriers. We are a less educated community than many people. Many of us leave school with many fewer qualifications than non-disabled people. The quality of education for disabled people is poor. There are financial barriers. Many of my participants wanted to study theology courses or go to conferences about disability in the church and couldn't afford to because we're a poorer community on the whole than non-disabled people. And there are access barriers. My visually impaired participants in particular talked about how books are not available in Braille or in audiobook. And there were barriers for those with learning difficulties and neurodivergent people as well. And as we've said, there are barriers to the priesthood and ministry that again stop us from having a voice in what's happening in the church. And yet my research participants were very capable of being theological agents. They shared theologies of diversity and embodiment and justice and inclusion and a fragile incarnated God in a real human body that the non-disabled church really needs to hear. And today, disabled Christians are meeting together in community on the edge of church, especially thanks to digital church, which is a whole new world for many of us. And we want to share our gifts with the church as active members and leaders. But while churches still have power over us, it's a challenge for us to exercise agency in churches. Whoops, I want to finish by giving the last word to Fiona Macmillan, who's a disabled leader in the church. Writing with Samuel Wells, she says, there's a power that comes with being listened to, being heard, but that can only ever happen when we are willing to speak and if we have the opportunity, the tools and resources. And that's about the church sharing power with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to give our interpreters the opportunity to switch over if they want to, need to. I think Rachel's hands are definitely on fire at this point. A number of questions coming through, and do feel free now to open your chat box and to pop your questions, observations in there. That would be great. Questions rather than general chit chat going, oh, Sam, I haven't seen you for ages. How are you doing? How's your mother? So if you can keep yourselves contained in that way, that will be really helpful. I think Mike has a question for us. So Mike, if you want to unmute and unvideo or video on and give us that question, that would be really helpful. Okay, so I'll unmute, but won't try rearranging the videos at this point. This is a question just from someone who preferred to remain anonymous. And referring to the fact, Katie, that you'd talked about Canon C4 and the way it talks about the bishop's decision. And the questioner says, we still have embedded discrimination against disabled people deep within our canons. They say that as a disabled clergy person, they have no legal protection from discrimination with regards to disability, no recourse to an employment tribunal as an office holder, the sort of CDM route for complaining about it is overseen by the bishop, therefore it's not an independent recourse available for addressing these challenges. And whilst there's been an anti-racism task force in the Church of England, this questioner doesn't see any such commitment at national level to address ableism. There are things going on at diocesan level, but in many dioceses that doesn't go much beyond ramps, loos and lifts. So have you any thoughts about how we can address the systemic ableism that is embedded throughout the Church of England? You know, even though some people's videos are off, I know the people who know me are going, does she have any opinions? Like heck she does. Oh, she's got a long list. My goodness, the systemic ableism of the Church of England, that's one to try and tackle overnight. So you're right. So for those who are not party to the Church of England strangeness and some of the jargon, once you are ordained as a curate in those first 3 or 4 years, you kind of are employed, so you do come under employment law, unless it's access to work, and then they start to look a bit twitchy about the whole thing and say you fall in between two stools, which is a really odd phrase I never got as a kid, but I do now as an adult. When you become the next stage of ordained ministry, so you become an incumbent or associate, but incumbent status, moving from curate to incumbent status, then you become an office holder, which means that nobody actually employs you. The church commissioners are the ones who process the money that goes into your bank account at the end of each month. And that's called a stipend, which has a legal status to it. It's a stipend, not a salary. And no one actually employs you. There is a pension fund, so you're treated like an employee in that sense, and you pay tax and national insurance, so you're an employee in that sense, small e, not capital E. And when someone was once taken to court over an issue around how clergy were treated, and the defense was, well, you know, they're an office holder, they're not employed by anybody, they're employed by God. The judge was heard to give the quick retort, well, I'm pretty sure God would be a good employer, so the Church of England should model the divine. I have to go and try and find that quote sometime. I hope it's not apocryphal. I really hope it's real. So there is something about recognizing that legally, anyone wearing a dog collar in the Church of England is in a tricky situation in terms of employment law and status. But the Equalities Act supersedes all of that. And we are not exempt. Okay, another loophole. When it came to being able to differentiate how you employ somebody on the basis of gender in terms of the priesthood of women, and therefore who could advertise for a woman priest for their next vicar's role, we were, through some curious loophole in the Equalities Act, allowed to discriminate on the basis of gender when advertising for an incumbent of a church. That's the only loophole. No other protected characteristic has that loophole. So the Church of England as an institution cannot legally discriminate on the basis of disability. And Canon C4 Part 3 is in direct odds with the Equalities Act. But who's going to challenge that in a court of law? I don't have what it takes to challenge the Church of England legally. I don't have the lawyers and the money they have, and I don't have the influence and the power. To change that canon would require General Synod to have it brought to them formally through all the structures in order to have a long debate, in order to see it changed. And that's a legal process. So if you're on General Synod, or you're on Diocesan Synod and can get a motion to General Synod, or you're on Deanery Synod to get a motion to Diocesan Synod to get a motion to General Synod to change Canon C4 in the light of the Equalities Act, I think that'll be very wise. But all these things take a lot of time. The chat box is basically lit up. I'm going to field this one to Naomi because Naomi is more au fait with some of the technical language around disability. So we've got things like physical disability, mental disability, learning disability, neurodivergency. So the different wordings we use as to how we describe each other and the different ways that people are under the influence of unhelpful powers in those situations. Naomi, do you want to grab some of that language?
Yeah, I was just having a look at that question. So I think Jane is asking whether there are different ways in which people are oppressed or disempowered in the church depending on their impairment. And my answer is yes, based on my research, but also no. There are some very interesting connecting experiences of ableism across all those groups. And that's what my research, what I was interested in looking at. There are a great deal of books about autism in the church, learning disability in the church, some on physical disability in the church, some on chronic illness in the church, most not written by us, but looking at us as separate groups of impairments and the specific challenges that we face. There's been much less written about disability as a category of people who are created as a social category because we fall short of these norms. And that's what I was particularly interested in. But yes, my participants who were blind had their own unique experiences of oppression that varied from my participants who were wheelchair users, and my neurodivergent participants had different experiences again. And what I'm hoping is that basically we need more research, and we need research from the perspective of blind theologians. We have a little bit already. We have the wonderful John Hull, but we need much more blind theologians and researchers looking at how blind people are particularly oppressed in the church. We need work with people with learning disabilities, not for them, that works with wonderful groups like WAVE, We're All Valued Equally, and the many groups that try to share power with those people. There are so many aspects of disability that we could look at, but for me it was really important to look at what we have in common, because there's a surprising amount, and we are a group of people who are being disempowered through ableism, and it's resulting in some very similar experiences, for example, for all my disabled clergy participants, who were all asked the same sorts of questions about whether they could give communion, whether they were blind or neurodivergent or wheelchair users. And we need to look first at the ableism in the church before we can look more closely at the individual experiences of disabled people. But the more research and more stories we have out there, the more we will learn about what's going on for different disabled people. And we need more of it from first-hand stories. We need more of it by us, not just for us.
It's interesting, there's another question further up I've sort of lost in the thread where the questions are all gone, because I'm holding one in front of me at the moment. But there was a question about, there seems to be an awful lot written about disability theology. Have we kind of reached the limits of it? And we just need to almost close the canon on that and say, look, here's the research and here's the resources. Off you go. Most of the books written about disability theology are written by non-disabled people. Which I find as incongruous as me, a white woman, writing about Black liberation theology as though I'm there. I can do it as an observer. I can hypothesize and offer perhaps observations into that community. But my book on Black liberation theology is not Black liberation theology. I mean, I haven't written one, just to be very clear, and I'd never dream of it. So much as I admire many theologians who are not disabled for writing observational theology on disability, they take up an awful lot of the bookshelf. And as Naomi said, I really, really want the disabled theologians, the disabled non-theologians, the thinkers, the narrators, the poets, the dreamers, to actually start to engage with the non-disabled world and say, here's where I see God in my disability and through it. And apparently that's theology. And I'm going to write this down, and you're going to read this and hear it from the inside. And then we'll have a conversation and a dialogue. So I definitely don't think that enough has been written on it. I just think the wrong people were writing too much of it in the first place. We had a technical question about the selection process, which is a complex, is it more mysterious than the Trinity? I'd rather preach on the Trinity than explain how the Church of England selection process works. But I'm on the inside, friends. I've just become a bishop's advisor for the Church of England selection process. So I'm being trained on how the thing works in the first place. And it's all changed through the pandemic. So how they did do it, I mean, they change it every 5 years, to be honest. So I'm in the next tranche of bishops' advisors in this new adjusted way of doing selection. And ask me in a year's time whether it's better for neurodivergent and disabled people. And I'll tell you what I think. It looks better, it looks more engaging, it looks more relational, it looks more creative. It seems to be that candidates have more agency over their story and how they tell it. But what you get on paper and what you get in reality often don't match anywhere. So come back to me in a year and ask me whether I think it's better or worse. Yeah. And also there was another question about the systems of the Church of England in terms of engaging with those who currently have the power and the agency, which is the higher up you go, thinking of a hierarchical structure in the Church of England, then the more power there seems to be. All of us, I'm guessing, would think, well, bishops have a lot of power. Justin Welby and Stephen Cottrell, archbishops, must have a huge amount of power. But if you ask them that question, they all demur and go, well, I haven't got the kind of power you think I do. And quite often I'll say, well, then what do you do exactly? Which Justin laughed at rather nervously and then said he had to go. You're right. To change a culture, you have to work out who has the power and the agency and who are the gatekeepers. And then, a bit like a ninja, although disabled people do not make good ninjas, we stand out far too, but the black clothing looks pretty cool. We have to kind of get alongside, we have to befriend, we have to learn the language, we have to recognize which are the levers that get pulled and who pulls the levers. Too many analogies, I'll stop now. And then earn the trust of the people who are on the inside and have the power, and learn the language and encourage different levers to get pulled. And one day, maybe we're the ones who end up pulling those levers and making those decisions. I would love, I said this 3 years ago at Lambeth Palace, name dropper, shameless, at a disability conference at Lambeth Palace, the irony of it being a very inaccessible building, but hey, we got just in there, so what can you do? And we were asked at the end of it, the panel, final panel, what one thing could make the biggest change in the C of E in terms of disability vocations? And my fellow panelists didn't have anything, in my opinion, useful to add to the conversation. So I offered to have their contributions and go for 10 suggestions. I was only given 2. And one of them was that I would love to see a visibly disabled person being consecrated as a bishop. Now, friends with hidden disabilities, I know, but you don't have a badge on the outside to declare it, and you may not want to own it publicly. So let those who are visibly disabled do the first bit, be the pioneers, and then come in after us and go, haha, there's more of us. So a physically, visibly disabled person, or someone who owns their disability, which might appear hidden or not on show, but who owns it publicly, being consecrated a bishop. I mean, that, just even saying it out loud makes me go, blimey, there'd be one of us up there doing the thing. My concern would be they'd be absorbed into the wider narrative that says conform and mask at all times. Now you're one of us. My hope would be they would pioneer and say, I don't wear a mask, and I'm not going to wear a mask even with a bishop. I'm just going to be me, who God's called me to be. And it'd be a powerful message to the church institutions, to people in the pews, to the world outside the church structures, to go, look, you see, there's one of us in that position of agency and power and lever pulling and door opening and gatekeeping, which means that there's hope for everybody else who feels they might have a call to whatever God is calling them to. I said that 3 years ago in front of Justin Welby, in a room full of people who could make it happen.
I'd love to come back on that, Katie, because I think you are right in many ways. We have this pastoral model of disability in the church that says that disabled people are here to be ministered to, and to see a disabled bishop could go some way to helping some people to question that. But my research is full of really worrying stories of ordinands and priests and ministers from other churches who had a terrible time with ableism. And inevitably, when we talk about changing institutions, if we're going to drop a disabled person into an ableist institution, we're asking a great deal of them. And I am sure that there is the right person out there who is called to that role, but it's such a challenge. How do we change the institution for those people going into those roles before we have those people in those roles to help change the institution? And it's going to be a potentially slow and painful journey. But yeah, we need to do better as a church at supporting people in those positions of power, because even a disabled bishop will still be disempowered in many ways as a disabled leader in the church.
We can learn a lot from the women who were first ordained as bishops, who were entering into what had been a male-only area. And I'm sure a lot of the men who didn't feel like they matched up to the manliness of what bishops are meant to be probably felt like a fish out of water as well. And so those women going into that very different space were pioneers themselves. And I think many may have masked in order to remain in that space. And not to be crushed by a system that said, well, you're here and tolerated, but we didn't really want you. And you're right, Naomi, to be the first disabled anything is the pioneer. And the risk is that you pioneer, but it crushes you. And it leaves a great pathway for those who come behind you. But what kind of cost does it have on you? Fiona rightly points out, and I have to hold my privilege up here, that actually priests have a huge amount of power and agency over lay people, and some of them have wielded it extraordinarily badly over the years, and some have not stepped up when they should have, and some have overly intervened when they should not have done. And as a privileged, able-bodied, masking, disabled woman in the COV with a dog collar, I have to recognize my own privilege in sitting here with a dog collar. And the cost to me was that I just pretended for many years I wasn't disabled. I mean, I got crutches and a gammy leg, so there's no hiding that. But you give the narrative of, I'll get better one day. It's only short term. And then owning it when my son was born 11 years ago, going, I'm disabled. If the church doesn't like it, sucks to be them, doesn't it? Because this is who I am. But that came also at quite a big cost to own and come out, if you like, as truly disabled. So it was very interesting. Naomi's unmiked again. Go for it.
I have, yeah. So I think Fiona's point is really important, and I should have made it earlier, that priests are only one way that the church changes. And actually, as we know, the Church of England's power should come up from the PCC upwards. And the only way that church culture is going to change is if we listen to the disabled laity, where many more disabled people will be than in the priesthood, at least in the foreseeable future, hopefully not forever. But yeah, we are down here at the bottom and on the edge, and we have a lot to offer the church if they can listen. Sometimes those structures of listening are not there within the hierarchical Church of England, and in some ways sometimes they are. We have some fantastic models for listening, like the St Martin in the Fields Disability Advisory Group that Fiona, who was asking the question, has founded, and other similar groups springing up in other churches and dioceses. And we need more of those kind of structures of listening, because it's only when churches listen to disabled people's experience that they can understand. You cannot see the water you're swimming in if you don't have lived experience of disability. And even when you do, I can't see the water I'm swimming in as a sighted person or a person without learning disabilities. So we need to listen to a huge groundswell of people, and we need more mechanisms for the church to do that.
Naomi, thank you. And I'm really aware that we've got this difficulty now between a huge amount of questions in the chat that we haven't touched on, and the fact that we're a minute over in our timing. Now, I'm on Oxford time, which is 5 minutes behind everything else. So I've got 4.5 minutes left. But I'm also very aware that Naomi and I both live with a certain level of managing our energy and our expectations of what we can and can't reasonably do well in a day. We can achieve loads, but can we do it all well? Not entirely. And Mike is also our timekeeper today and has just messaged me to go, would you like me to draw things to a close? And I think the answer probably is yes. So I'm going to suggest that if anyone would like to do something like this again, then you get in touch with Mike, and he or I on the Dawson Ministry and Mission Zoom thing, I haven't asked permission yet, but I'll apologize afterwards, just does another evening on this, so we can more freely talk through some of these issues that have come up and take some more of the issues that have come up in the chat box. And we'll find a way of doing that in spring or early summer next year. Mike will put his details in the chat box so that you can find him later. But if you Google Mike Higton, if you Google Katie Tupling, and if you Google Naomi Lawson Jacobs, you will find us all. That sounds really egocentric, doesn't it? You will find us on Google, via Google, or other search engines are available. And just get in touch with us and say, yep, if you're going to do something again, count me in. Mike, take over.
Thank you so much. Thank you for fantastic and challenging and exciting input from Katie and from Naomi, and for amazingly skillful interpretation from Rachel and other Naomi. I hope that people will be interested not just in talking more about this session, but in future sessions as well. We see this as an ongoing series of webinars with interconnected themes that will keep on coming up. Our next webinar, the next planned webinar, is Tuesday, the 15th of February, 2 p.m. We're alternating afternoon and evening slots to try and make them available to different ranges of people. And that will be Anderson Jeremiah on colonialism and power in the Church of England. We do have a variety of webinars already planned, but if you have suggestions for future webinars or for spin-offs, as Katie was just suggesting, please do get in touch. We are eager, within the limits of our time and energy, to make this work for as wide a range of people as possible and to take the conversation further. So if you hang around just in a moment. I'll put my contact details in the chat. I'll also put a link to the video from the first webinar. So anyone who's not seen that will be able to copy that link, and I won't take those down. I won't stop the meeting for a couple of minutes just so you have a chance to copy those things down. But do get in touch if you've got any suggestions for how we carry on running this in future, or for future webinars, or you want to propose a session, and the steering group will be very happy to think and talk about all of those things. But thank you again to Katie, to Naomi, to Rachel, and to Naomi for a fantastic session today, and to all of you for your questions and contributions.